Davis, and I'm the Foundation's Executive Director. So if you have any questions about the art on the walls or the history of the Grosses beyond what we're covering tonight, do please let me know after the discussion. So I would like to begin by acknowledging our collaborator on this program tonight, Village Preservation. We have been very lucky to work with Village Preservation on a number of projects over the years, and they very kindly gave us our plaque in the front of our building. So definitely take a look at that before you come out this evening. I would also like to mention our two generous funders for our programming. So the New York State Council on the Arts, and also the Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council of New York City. So we're very grateful for their support. So now I'd like to keeping my comments short, I would like to introduce Yana Lysenko, who we have worked with over the past year. I feel very lucky, and I'm actually very sad to say this is the fourth and final program of the series, so she will no longer be working with us, but I hope she'll still remain in our realm. She is a pre-doctoral candidate at New York University. She is in the Department of Comparative Lit and also Russian and Slavic Studies. So her focus in her dissertation is really looking at urban identity in a variety of different sources. So she really worked very hard on this program and really brings a lot of her own research into the discussion. So, welcome, Yana.
Hello everyone, thanks for joining us tonight. So tonight marks the fourth and final event of our lecture and panel series, Memories of Manhattan. Tracing Chaim and Renee Gross's trajectory across 4 different Manhattan neighborhoods from the early 20th century to the new millennium, the series has explored the way that collective memory reveals itself in these vibrant neighborhoods and considers the way that we can preserve this memory within the constant change of New York City. We started with the Lower East Side with the first event, continued to Harlem with the second, and then moved on to Soho in our panel 2 weeks ago. In this final event, we focus on where Chaim and Renee's story ends, here in the heart of Greenwich Village, just down the street from Washington Square Park at 526 LaGuardia Place, which is now the home of the Renee and Chaim Gross Foundation. 526 LaGuardia would ultimately become not only an ideal studio space for Chaim, but also Chaim and Renee's home until Chaim's death in 1991 and Renee's in 2005. Chaim had several studios in Greenwich Village before they moved to this building, one at 12th and Horatio Street and one on 9th Street. The Grosses ultimately bought this building in 1962 from the art shipping company Berkeley Express. Because the LaGuardia building was previously an industrial space, they spent a year renovating their new home to convert it into a residential building that could also accommodate a studio space for Chaim. Modernist architects Don Ryman and Arthur Malzahn were hired to design and complete the renovations. In practice, however, Chaim himself would substantially influence the outcomes of the designs. The renovations in both his studio on the ground floor and the residential floors above would reflect both his and Renee's impact. An immense amount of light pours into his studio workspace thanks to the massive skylight overhead and illuminates the gallery just adjacent. This openness and light contrasts with the more brooding elements of other parts of the building with the wrought iron gate that marks the entrance to the building. The dark rugs of the 3rd floor living and dining room that we now sit in evoke a 19th century European salon with the art plastered all over the walls, as I'm sure you've all seen already. Such design showcases both the Grosses and designers' dedication to an aesthetic that would combine both modernist and traditional elements throughout the external and internal design of the building while reflecting the Grosses' own personal tastes. The home and studios of other famous sculptors that Chaim had admired, like Auguste Rodin and Constantin Brancusi, clearly also had an impact on him and served as models for how he wanted his own studio to look. The bohemian nature of Greenwich Village in the 1960s inevitably also had an impact on Chaim and Renee's choice to move to the neighborhood of Greenwich Village as one of New York's artistic and cultural epicenters. The couple continued their tradition of hosting events, fundraisers, and artistic gatherings in their home, just as they had done in their Harlem apartment before. The importance that Chaim and Renee placed on having a space of conversation and gathering reflects in their own vision for the foundation, and this tradition continues today with events like this panel tonight. I'm excited to welcome our speakers for this evening. Andrew Berman has served as Executive Director of Village Preservation, a community-based 501c3 organization dedicated to preserving the special architectural and cultural heritage of Greenwich Village, the East Village, and NoHo since 2002. In that time, he has led the organization in successful efforts to secure landmark designation of over 1,250 buildings, including groundbreaking designations honoring LGBTQ+, African American, immigrant, and artistic and countercultural history. An architectural historian, he has also worked extensively in the fields of tenant and housing advocacy, as well as cultural preservation, particularly for underrepresented groups, having been involved with efforts to secure first ever federal recognition of sites connected to hip hop and LGBTQ history. Michelle Herman's first novel, Save the Village, was a finalist for the Eric Hoffer Prize. She's also the author of 2 poetry chapbooks, Victory Boulevard and Just Another Jack, The Private Lives of Nursery Rhymes. Her work has appeared in recent issues of Carve, Plowshares, The Hudson Review, The Sun, and many other journals. She's a devoted teacher at the Writers Studio, a developmental editor, award-winning translator of Jacques Brel songs, columnist at the Village Sun and Lit Hub, and is approaching her 40th year as a villager. John Sorensen has lived in and around Greenwich Village since 1986. His books include A Sister's Memories, the story of American children's rights activist Grace Abbott, and The Mystical Filmmaker with counterculture writer and director Peter Whitehead. While working with screenwriter J. Preston Allen, John was the assistant director of her Tony Award-winning play, True. He has produced, written, and directed a wide range of arts and cultural programs, including for the U.S. Department of State, public television, and the Chicago Humanities Festival. He's currently working on a book telling the story of the village's fabled Hotel Earl, now the Washington Square Hotel. Welcome, everybody. And just one quick note before we begin. So we'll start with an introduction from each of the panelists, and then I will ask a few questions, we'll have a conversation, and then we'll open it up for the audience. So if you have any questions, please keep them in your thoughts, and then we'll be happy to discuss. And please do come with questions.
Thank you very much. Is the clicker over there? Oh, here we go. Great. All right. Thank you. So I'm Andrew Berman. I'm the Executive Director of Village Preservation. I think they're gonna...
Sorry.
That's okay. While she's setting that up, as mentioned before, we're a nonprofit, community-based organization, and we work to try to preserve the special architectural and cultural heritage of Greenwich Village, the East Village, and NoHo, and we do that through a variety of means, which I'm going to talk a little bit about. But in the context of tonight's, in the context of tonight's conversation, the neighborhoods that we work in are so incredibly rich in history and memory, and they're such an important part of what draws people to them and what they're about, and yet at the same time that memory and that history is so incredibly fragile. In a lot of ways, the desirability that they create, the richness, the engagement that they create with the public is in some ways their own worst enemy, because by drawing people to the neighborhoods, which of course we want, they've been meccas in different ways for many, many years, left unchecked, that could easily destroy exactly the qualities that people love about it. The fact that there is this 200-plus-year-old history, that there's a connection to these greats who walked these streets and accomplished incredible things here. So we'll talk about a few ways in which we try to both keep that memory alive physically, as well as through educational purposes. And this just gives a few more details about what was kind of said before. We're at villagepreservation.org, and this map shows the neighborhood with some of the places where we've had an impact in terms of landmarking and zoning protections. Just to kind of give you a sense of some of the things that we are working on and that are particularly potent issues right now. At both the city and the state level, we're seeing this huge push to increase the allowable size and scale of new market rate housing development in New York City, based upon the idea that if we just build more expensive housing, somehow housing will become cheaper for everybody by a filtering down process. And believe it or not, it's a widely held belief, and one that certainly informs public policy right now. So one of the things that we're doing is kind of trying to push back on that. The mayor has something called the City of Yes plan, which is literally thousands of different ways in which he wants to change the rules throughout New York City in terms of how development can take place, which would definitely have a huge impact on our neighborhoods, and we're pushing back on that. One of our recent projects, I think some of you in this room were at this demonstration about a year and a half ago on Gay Street. We're a landmarked 200-year-old building that was actually the inspiration for the beloved My Sister Eileen and wonderful town, was actually destroyed through illegal work. And unfortunately, what we see all too frequently is the city is really not doing its job in terms of enforcing existing regulations and protecting places. 5G towers, we could have a whole evening discussion about those. Those are proliferating in our neighborhood. We do research on buildings in our neighborhood, particularly endangered ones like this one, 50 West 13th Street. Many of you know and love this building. It was the home of the 13th Street Repertory Theater for many generations. Going back to the 19th century, though, it was a hub of African-American civil rights activism. This woman, Sarah Smith Garnett, who, if you happen to have been watching The Gilded Age this past season, there was a whole storyline about her. She lived here for about 10 years. The house was owned by a gentleman named Jacob Day, who was one of the richest and most successful black men in New York City. This was in the 19th century when Greenwich Village was the center of black life in New York. We're trying to get this building landmarked. It's currently endangered. Pushing back on a state bill that would basically allow houses of worship to more or less ignore landmarks and zoning regulations. Here's an area where we're spending a lot of time, and those of you who follow the work, we do know this, and that's what we call the area south of Union Square. We've had a landmarking push for this area. Let me see, yeah, here we go. Basically the area from 14th Street to 9th Street, 3rd Avenue to just west of 5th Avenue, which kind of straddles Greenwich Village and the East Village, kind of falls in between them. Doesn't have the landmark protections of Greenwich Village, doesn't have the zoning protections of the East Village, but in the mid-20th century, this was really the center of the art world of the entire Western world. And there's an incredible array of architecture and other kinds of history, as you can see from these tours from our website. So this is an area where we're focused on trying to get it landmarked. As mentioned before, we do focus a lot on diverse histories. This is a building here that we're trying to save. Our Lady of Guadalupe Church on the north side of 14th Street was actually the first church in New York for a Spanish-speaking congregation. Back when Spanish-speaking New Yorkers, Hispanic New Yorkers were a tiny, tiny, tiny minority. Of course, now they're more than 1/3 of all New Yorkers. This building here, which was not far from here, 85th Avenue, which was the headquarters of the very first national gay civil rights organization in America. This building here on 2nd Avenue and 13th Street, which was the very first hospital ever built for people with hearing and visual disabilities, the New York Eye and Ear Infirmary. This building here, which was the headquarters of the New York City Women's Suffrage League. So these are all places that we try to bring these histories to light and see them protected. We also do a lot of programming, like of course what we're doing here today, and here's just from our YouTube page example of some of the programs we've done in just the last couple of weeks. So that all lives on our website. We also have a plaque program, which, as mentioned before, one of them is right here on this building. James Baldwin is one of them. We have about 25 of these throughout Greenwich Village, the East Village, and NoHo. We have an interactive map where you can learn the stories behind them, but of course, just having those plaques on those buildings so that as people walk by, they can see them. The most recent one we did was for the designer, photographer, artist, Saul Leiter over on East 10th Street. We just added that last month. We also do a lot of work around small businesses. That's such an important part of the history and character of our neighborhoods. Some of them can be somewhat ephemeral. They may be here for a few years and disappear. Others have been here for 100 years or more. We want to make sure that in the age of Amazon and chain stores that small, independently owned stores and businesses have as much of a fighting chance as possible in our neighborhood, and we try to do that through a variety of different means. Many of you know, because I've seen you at them, we also have our Village Awards each year. This year coming up on June 12th, where we honor and celebrate people who've really contributed to the character and history of the neighborhood, whether it's a community leader, an artist, a neighborhood institution. We try to make sure that their stories are told, celebrated, and honored, and we do this in a big public event in front of hundreds of people. We also have an oral history project. We've got about 70 oral histories with great artists, writers, activists, business owners connected to the neighborhood. Let's see, we have here Calvin Trillin, John Guar, Mimi Sheridan, Jane Jacobs, who was on our board of advisors. This is Merce Cunningham, my brain is sort of freezing here. This is Margot Gale. So really this incredibly rich array of people. We try to get their first person account of what they did, what they experienced, what life in the neighborhood was like, what these challenges were that they faced, and how they address them down in writing and on tape so that it's there forever for people to be able to learn from. And we also, during the COVID years, instead of doing our annual house tour, we did something called Village Voices, which was an interactive outdoor art exhibit which went up throughout the neighborhood at places where some of these incredible people did these incredible things. And we created these with a wonderful artist, these shadow boxes which shed some light on these people and what they did at this location. I see that's Jackson Pollock over there, for instance. But it was also interactive in that you could scan a QR code and listen to some of these great people, Rachel Maddow, Ed Norton, Jesse Eisenberg, John Leguizamo, talking about them, what they did. We've given this a permanent home on our website, so it lives there now forever. So again, this is a way of trying to keep those memories and those stories alive. And as I mentioned before, we have an annual benefit house tour each year. Now we're back to doing that. I know some of you have participated. It's not cheap, but you can also volunteer for it, and you can get access for free that way. It's our only expensive event each year, which allows us to do everything else that you see me talking about here for free, including events like tonight. And it's also just a wonderful way to celebrate and get a little insight into what people have done with these incredible properties that we all get to see. We also have a lot of wonderful interactive maps on our website. Last year was the 50th anniversary of the birth of hip hop. We did a map showing different sites in our neighborhoods that were connected to the history of hip hop. This was a very important, a very popular map that we added. And then here's some of the other maps that we have on our website. I mentioned before, and we've seen the Civil Rights and Social Justice map, South of Union Square map. We also have a series of maps and tours of the Greenwich Village Historic District, of the East Village. We have a series of maps called Beyond the Village and Back that look at great landmarks throughout New York City that are not located here, but that have origin stories connected to our neighborhoods that you might have never known about. We have a map celebrating a Greek Revival architecture and a women's suffrage history map, again, all specifically connected to our neighborhoods and the roles that they played in these things. We also have this wonderful and growing historic image archive, which has about 4,500 images in it. And one of the most interesting things about it is almost all of the images were donated by people like you. They're your own personal collections, they're your family collections, they're your grandparents' collections, they're pictures you took 40 or 50 years ago when you were a student and documenting something. So here are just some of the examples of some of these wonderful collections that exist on our website that people have, for the most part, donated to us. Fred W. McDara, who was the photographer for the Village Voice for many years, his family very generously donated several of his images to us. This one of Willem de Kooning. This is from the Center for Migration Studies. It's images largely from the turn of the 20th century of Italian immigrants in the neighborhood. This woman, Meredith Jacobson Marciano, she was a location scout for many years for movies, so she used to scour the neighborhood and other places for interesting scenes. Ruth E. Cushman, I'm sure you've heard of the real estate firm Cushman and Wakefield. She's from that family, and she donated a whole bunch of images to us of our neighborhoods in the early 20th century. So really just a great way to get some insights into what our neighborhood is about, what people's memories of it is, to see places that you may have seen 50, 60 years ago but don't even remember. They're captured on film, and there's very specific ways in which people's personal photographs can help tell the story. This was a great one here. This guy in the late 1960s was an architecture student when Soho was an almost completely deserted neighborhood, and he was fascinated with cast iron architecture, which there was just the first glimmers of this sort of reappreciation of what cast iron architecture was, and he did a photo project documenting this deserted neighborhood full of what he thought were beautiful buildings, and he donated them to us. Here's just a few more of them. That's it. Oh yes, I can go back. It's okay, you sort of saw them. So just to wrap up, we do try to engage the public in many, many different ways to understand and appreciate what makes the neighborhood so special, to give you ways of getting involved in these preservation battles, but also in things as simple as telling us your stories, sharing with us your pictures, things like that, to make sure that the memories of our neighborhoods, which are so, so special, live on. So thank you for doing that.
Hi, everybody. I may need to hold it after all. Thank you, first of all, to Yana and to all the people who work for the Gross Foundation. I'm so happy to be here. I've been here before, but I never got to talk here before. So I'm a different kind of a preservationist, although I used to be the kind of preservationist that Andrew is. I moved here in 1985 with my then boyfriend, my now longtime husband, and we couldn't believe our good fortune at getting to live in the village. I still remember the name of the realtor who called us up. We had both been at Columbia. We were living in Morningside Heights, assumed we would stay up there, and Carol Andros, the realtor, called and said, I have this little place on Jane Street, you want to take a look? And we took a look, and we fell madly in love. I'm going to read a little piece about coming to the West Village in a minute. And so we got to live in the West Village and threw ourselves deeply into preservation activities in the neighborhood. In those days, it was a very informal little band of people. I felt like the forces we were fighting were a little smaller as well than they are now. And so we became very active members in an organization called Save the Village, and that's also the name of my novel. Save the Village, that incarnation of Save the Village in the 80s, started by a woman who became a good friend named Pearl Broder, and the name was an homage to Jane Jacobs, whose organization at some points was called Save the Village, or the committee to Save the Village. So for many years, my husband and I worked tirelessly trying to fight over development, trying to clean up the waterfront, trying to save the High Line back when we thought it was going to be this little informal thing off to the side. And being a writer, I always felt more comfortable sitting quietly at my desk doing my work than putting myself out publicly. And so I've come to think of the work that I've done since then in writing, first for The Villager and now for The Village Sun, which is kind of an offshoot from The Villager. That's a long story. And my novel, I like to think that I'm a preservationist, preserving my own experience and the greater village experience with my words, whether I'm writing nonfiction columns or writing fiction. So now I'm going to read, I was looking through some of my old pieces from The Villager. I don't remember the exact year when I started writing for them, and that was several owners ago, sometime around the turn of the century, and I came across this piece. I'm just going to read the beginning of it just to give you a sense of my own first introduction to the Far West Village, which has been home now for 40 years. And this is from a piece called Newcomer, Old Timer. I do not have a PowerPoint, in part because I'm not competent, in part because being a writer, I feel as if my job is to paint pictures with words, so I'm going to do that. So this is from Newcomer, Old Timer. The first time I came to the Far West Village was a Saturday evening in the 80s. I was flanked by my best friend and my boyfriend because we were grad students and traveled in these lopsided groups. And we held $1 student vouchers to an off Broadway show at something called the West Beth Theater. We traveled downtown from Morningside Heights, got off the number 1 train, and started walking west. There, at dusk, on the west side of 7th Avenue, far from the familiar village of falafel stands and leather shops, the world was settled and serene. We passed ye old Waverly Inn, where a tree grew through the dining room, and the famously confused West 4th Street, which crossed West 10th, 11th, and 12th. And we peered into the brick row houses of Bank Street. I found myself coveting it all. I wanted the ceiling moldings that some handy husband had no doubt lovingly cleaned with an old toothbrush. I wanted the table lamps, every one of which cast a soft and practical glow. But what did it matter? Villagers were clearly already lit from within. More than anything, I wanted that sense of serviceability that had always fascinated me about Manhattan, far more than its taller, newer, and more obvious attractions. I loved the way New Yorkers took what had been bequeathed by their forebears and made it work so well for them. It was such a different ethos from the post-war world I came from in Connecticut, where my house and my school and my supermarket were all younger than I was, and so spread out a person could get lost. Here in the West Village, the narrow streets were still paved with cobblestones, the homes with brick cut by a pair of 19th century hands, and the parlors with hardcover books, the set of Hemingway, the Faulkner, the Calvino, the Gide, the work of sturdy, wise women like Jane Jacobs, Karen Horney, and Grace Paley would be on those shelves too, and you never knew. Their rear ends might be plunked on this brocaded sofa or that stickly rocker. We were a student of international affairs, a student of art history, and me, the student with no discipline at all, the student of writing. We walked west on Bank Street until it graciously disappeared to accommodate a huge, shabby, sunken playground. Though I was supposed to be the one with the imagination, in my wildest dreams that Saturday night, I never thought I'd become a decade-long denizen of that playground, spending most evenings of the 90s emptying its sand from my sneakers and the small sneakers of my 2 sons. Bank Street resumed on the far side of Hudson, and still we walked, smelling tides now, possibly even the faintest whiff of the Atlantic, past more brick houses on a less grand scale, past marine supply businesses, old stables, and warehouses. Like time travelers, we had walked so far, we found ourselves enchanted in a 19th century maritime village. Just before the Hudson, we passed under an old elevated rail line and arrived at this vast courtyarded former factory called Westbeth, where we saw a play about a bartender that none of us can remember. So there you have a little excerpt from one of my village columns. Thank you. Okay, so now I was thinking about my novel, which is all about made-up people in the village who I wanted to feel very much like real people in the village. And since I have a really long experience of living among villagers, I felt like I was qualified to do that. My main character is a tour guide, and I think that idea came from the fact that the very first weekend my husband and I moved to the little place on Jane Street, we went on a walking tour with a guy named Michael Levin, who died very young, not that long after that tour, and we were so enthralled with everything that he showed us that I wanted to make my main character a tour guide. She's a woman though, so my novel is filled with all these little in-jokes, that some of which are so obscure, and nobody but me knows what the references are. There's a moment when she's giving a bad tour. It's a chapter called The Bad Tour, and she hits a car, and that was a little in-joke because when I first started taking a fiction class at the writer's studio in the village, the very first story I wrote, I tried to write about a woman who hit a car, and I didn't know how to write fiction yet, so I put that in the novel. So I have just a trivia quiz I want to give, just one question. So the main character is named Becca Cammeyer, Cammeyer. That's a name I thought long and hard about. I'm wondering if anybody knows what the New York reference is to that name. I don't even know if it's pronounced Cammeyer or Cammeyer. I think of it as Cammeyer. Anybody know that name? This is quite obscure, and it's a Chelsea name. It's not a village name. So there's a beautiful red brick building on the southeast corner of 6th Avenue and 20th Street, where the Blick art supply store is, now right across the street from what used to be the Limelight. That building was originally the Cammeyer shoe manufacturing company in the era of Ladies Mile, and that was an in-joke to myself as well, because I used to write for Metropolis magazine, and the very first feature piece I did for them was about Ladies Mile, when Ladies Mile was just becoming a thing, and all those big old department stores were getting repopulated. So the Cammeyer shoe manufacturing company, and if you Google Cammeyer, up will come these beautiful 19th century shoes, some of which are in the Metropolitan Museum. So it's a little piece of trivia. So let's see, what else do I want to talk about? I wasn't sure what direction to go in with this talk. I was thinking about how I met a very nice lawyer who lives in Berkeley a couple of weeks ago, who was in the city and who was kind of grilling me about, what's it really like to live in the village? Is the village like the village? And I was hard pressed to give him a simple answer. My first thought was, no, the village isn't anything like the village. And I got to talking about serving on my co-op board, still in the Far West Village, although now on 12th Street, and sometimes being dismayed at the priorities of the people I serve with on the board. It's a mixed bag. There's lovely new people who move in, but there's money here now. There's big money here now, and the conversation tends to be about the comparables. Everybody's panicky about, is our building measuring up to the other buildings in the neighborhood? They talk about the restaurants. So, there's not as much talk about the galleries and the jazz and the theater, and that makes me very sad. But then, on the other hand, I increasingly spend time at West Beth, which is just a block away from me. I take a little free singing class there late Friday afternoons. You're all welcome to come. It's the most amazing thing. It's welcome to all. I am not a singer, I have a place where I get to sing every week. So I feel like I've become a kind of an honorary West Beth person, and the village is very much alive over there, and my singing teacher is organizing a monthly concert series, First Fridays, and so we go to these free concerts every Friday evening, and they're fantastic, and they're West Beth residents who are coming and just donating their time, and people get up and dance, and whatever's going on, it's really talented, generous people. So it's still the village. Let's see. I know a 3-generation family at West Beth, which is really wonderful. That I watch little kids who are growing up there in the same tradition. Now I think I will read just a little excerpt from Save the Village, and later, if anybody's interested, there's some copies back there. I can sell you copies of the book. So I thought, since we're here in the South Village, I'd read a little excerpt that takes place in the South Village. I've never read this part before. So this is from the first chapter. The first chapter is a tour. We meet Becca, and we meet a group of 6 women who are visiting from South Carolina, who've come to take her walking tour on a Tuesday evening. Okay, so we're meeting up with them in the middle of the tour. Becca walked them down to what she called the South Village, below Washington Square. She called it the Crucible, what made the village, and maybe what made the U.S. the U.S. They followed her down McDougal Street, where the 60s seemed to be something of a chronic condition. Tiny falafel shops, down or up half flights of shallow steps, bongs as grand as Murano chandeliers displayed in storefronts. Becca stopped them in front of a rundown 6-story apartment building, very much like its neighbors, and said, "The poor will always be with us." The building was formed of grimy bricks, wooden window frames reduced to flakes, and an iron railing shedding chunks of what was surely pure lead paint. The whole building seemed to be imprisoned behind crisscrossing fire escapes. She was amazed when they all bowed their heads, church-like. Now let's talk about the invisible buildings and the invisible people who lived in them. It's not like they're not trying to get your attention. Some forgotten Italian immigrant worked very hard carving that stone. If you step back a little, you can see the name carved above the door. You can be darn sure Olivia wasn't any wife or daughter of his. She had them now. She could see it in their eyes. So much was already lost, but maybe it wasn't too late to save the South Village. "Do me one little favor," she said as she passed out goldenrod yellow pre-addressed postcards. "Drop a postcard in the mail. Jot a note to the Landmarks Commission and tell them about your visit. Tell them you think they should calendar the South Village." That's the language. It helps like crazy. They listen to tourists. For those who haven't used snail mail in a while, a postcard stamp costs 33 cents. They said, "Of course, we'd be happy to," as they slipped the cards into side pockets of their purses. She could tell they meant it. They understood. It wasn't an agenda. It wasn't a quid pro quo. It was a love they shared now. Becca would have kept on walking them all evening. There was so much to show them. She would take them west to the Hudson to watch mallards rise and fall with each passing wave, where the great ocean liners were once berthed. She would tell them the story of the man who used to give pony rides in a dusty vacant lot when she was a kid. A village populated with ghosts, the only home she had ever known. Okay, and I think I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Hello. My name is John Swanson, and I'm writing a book now about the old Hotel Earl. I assume some of you know what I'm talking about. A very rough and rowdy place in its day, and is now a beautiful Washington Square hotel. Okay. So, what I would like to do tonight is to go back to the sources of some of the things that we've been hearing about the preservation, to some of the people that are being preserved, so to speak, or some of the things. So I would like to just give you a few nice little tips that I've enjoyed while preparing everything. The first is from Jejuna Barnes, the novelist. 1916, she wrote, "Why has Washington Square a meaning, a fragrance, so to speak? The square has memories of great lives and possibilities therefore. Here on the north side are stately houses inhabited by great fortunes, and all those whose names rustle like silk petticoats. On the other side are congeries of houses and hovels, where vegetables and fruits are sold in the street as in Naples, and ice cream is made in the bedrooms, and spaghetti on the cellar floor. Here is the den where the gunmen conspired recently to shoot down the free trade butcher, and here the row of houses whose inhabitants provide the woman's night court with half its sensations. Satin and motor cars on this side, squalor and push cars on that. It is the contrast which gives life, stimulates the imagination, incites to love and hatred." But she did a beautiful job to kind of encapsulate what is an important part for me is the distinctive, all of these communities, cheek to jowl, with totally different backgrounds and agendas. A brief description of the book I'm working on and of the subject. From 1903 till 1986, it was called the Earl. It began life as a fashionable apartment hotel for folks such as P.G. Wodehouse, and careened slowly and surely into being, by the early 1960s, a kind of flophouse palace for little-known musicians and writers, including the 20-year-old Bob Dylan, all en route to its hard times in the 1970s as a much-denounced welfare hotel and a safe haven for a diverse group of junkies, hookers, and proud social deviants. Nowadays, it's known as the Washington Square Hotel and is a kind of partisan auberge. In its 120 years, it has been home base, in fact or in fiction, to everyone from Ernest Hemingway and Dylan Thomas to filmmaker John Waters and Warhol superstar Candy Darling to painter Jean-Michel Basquiat and writer Patricia Highsmith. There are many famous names connected with the little hotel on Washington Square, but perhaps the best parts of the hotel stories are those that share the thoughts and experiences of not famous guests and fellow travelers. A teenage prostitute who attended parties at the Earl circa 1969 when the demise of Stonewall Inn came. A woman explorer who was preparing to make an expedition to the jungles of South America and who held a press conference in the hotel's lobby. And, last but not least, a frustrated artist who attempted to commit suicide by jumping out of his hotel room window, but kept missing the window and falling back into his room. Here are a few little snapshots of things connected with some of the writers and personages who we've been discussing. 1961, and this links together two different sides of the coin of that era. 1961 involves Bob Dylan, singer-songwriter, and Jane Jacobs, journalist and activist. In 1961, Bob Dylan met the social activist Jane Jacobs, and Ms. Jacobs' son, Jim, recalls, "My mother and Bob Dylan wrote a song together. Jane needed a protest song for the fight against the Lower Manhattan Expressway. A friend of ours, Harry Jackson, an artist, had a folk singer named Bob Dylan sleeping on his floor. Harry sent Dylan around to the house, and Jane helped Dylan, telling him how a protest song was structured and how it worked. I think it was the first protest song Dylan ever wrote. Nobody recorded it. The song was called Listen, Robert Moses. It's not the world's greatest song, but it is an interesting piece. I'll give you one chorus from the song by both Dylan and Jacobs. Listen, Robert Moses, listen if you can. It's all about our neighborhood that you're trying to condemn. We aren't going to sit back and see our homes torn down, so take your superhighway and keep it out of town. We won't be moved, buddy. We won't be moved. We're fighting for our homes and we aren't going to lose." That's for Jane. Another couple who are pretty famous in their own right, John and Michelle Phillips, the Mamas and the Papas in the 60s. Beautiful little recollection he had of staying at the Hotel Earl back in that period, and how the song California Dreaming came to be. This is John Phillips speaking. He said, it's my recollection that Michelle and I were staying at the Earl Hotel in New York, and Michelle was asleep. I was playing the guitar. We'd been out for a walk that day, and she'd just come from California, and all she had was California clothing. And it snowed overnight, and in the morning she didn't know what the white stuff coming out of the sky was, because it never snowed in Southern California. So we went for a walk, and the song is mostly just a narrative of what happened that day. We stopped into a church to get her warm, and so on and so on. And so as I was thinking about it later that night, I was playing and singing, and I thought, California Dreamin' was what we were doing, actually, that day. So I tried to wake Michelle up to write the lyrics down, and she said, leave me alone. I want to sleep, I want to sleep. Wake up, write this down, you'll never regret it, I promise you, Michelle. Okay, then she wrote it down and went back to sleep. Another music person and a very wonderful neighborhood person. I don't know if some of you knew Joe Mara with the Night Owl Cafe. But Night Owl Cafe was on 3rd Street, I believe, just off McDougal. Is that right? Yeah. So Fred Neil, of course, wrote Everybody's Talking, that became the song from Midnight Cowboy that was so famous. And this is a story that Joe told to me over at Cafe Chino, where he was in regal throne every Saturday at least, and sometimes more than that. Joe said, I wish I could imitate his voice, but I'm not even going to try. Very Italian New York from days gone by. Joe recalls, some of the musicians that worked in my cafe, the Night Owl, would sometimes stay at the Hotel Earl. One of them, Fred Neil, had stayed there, and musicians sometimes didn't have any money. Fred didn't pay his hotel bills. Working at the Night Owl, we would put the names of the different performers on the sign out front. So Fred was performing, and we had his name on the sign, and I guess the Earl's manager saw that sign because we suddenly started getting all these crazy calls from the Earl Hotel. They were harassing me because Fred hadn't paid his hotel bill. I had no control over Fred, and well, in my club we had only one telephone in those days, and the Earl kept calling and calling and calling. So I asked them, please, you're tying up our phone. We only have one phone for the business, and you keep calling. We hang up, and you keep calling. They wouldn't stop. I got really annoyed, and I went over there to the Earl with my manager, Steve Sachs, and we took their switchboard from behind the desk and threw it in the street. After that, they didn't call anymore. And now, just one of the unknown people who were all around that area back in the 60s and 70s, a woman who just goes by the name Sylvia. Sylvia the Hooker is the name of the story. It was a teenage girl who was working the streets. Around the corner from Sylvia's 6th Avenue apartment, down Waverly Place, near McDougal Street, is the Hotel Earl. 8 stories of dirty brick, home of the hotel's bar, which was named Dr. Feelgood's Happy Time, and other assorted pleasures, resident and transient. Sylvia recalls her friend Kim's fascination with the Earl Hotel. She said, my friend Kim used to always sing that song set to the melody from Alice's Restaurant. You can get anything you want at the good old Hotel Earl. She always wanted to go over there and hang around. That place is real funny farm. Freaks all over the place. The place is always burning down, and there's police and I don't know, all kinds of crazy parties. You can't even tell for sure which ones are the boys. Kimmy always thought it was fun to go there, but if I go somewhere to meet boys, I want to make sure he's a boy. And one last farewell from the events was a fellow who was recollecting when he first moved to New York in the late 60s and took a room at the Hotel Earl. His only reminiscence from it was, my mom came to visit me when I was staying at the Earl. She cried when she saw my room.
Okay, thank you so much to all 3 of our speakers. So I am going to ask maybe like 2 questions in one more specific, one more broad. So since we're talking about the village, we've heard so many different stories, so many different experiences of the village. My first question, a more specific one, is, every New Yorker has their own perception of where a neighborhood starts and where a neighborhood ends. Where does the village start? Where does it end? What are its boundaries and its borders? And that's the more kind of logical question, but also, we're talking about the village, about this very particular neighborhood, we've heard so many different experiences of it, but what is it exactly that makes it special compared to other New York neighborhoods? Like, what is its really unique characteristic, in your opinion? So,
That's an encyclopedia.
I mean, yes, but perhaps maybe the first couple of things that come to mind, whoever would like to speak.
Happy to give it a shot. We grapple with this border question all the time. The easy one is 14th Street is the north, the Hudson River is the west. Then it gets a little fuzzier. We typically divide the Greenwich Village from the East Village using 4th Avenue and the Bowery. Of course, then you get into kind of NoHo, and when does it stop being the Village and start being, NoHo? Is it Mercer Street? Is it Broadway? Sort of where have you. And then the southern boundary is also kind of fuzzy because most people would now say it's Houston Street, but historically Houston Street was a tiny little street just like all the streets to the north and south until around the 1940s when they widened it to make way for the subway underneath. So a lot of those blocks of Thompson and Sullivan, to say nothing of Charlton and King and Van Dam, were all part of Greenwich Village originally, and we still think of them that way as well. I'm sure virtually everybody in this room probably has at least somewhat different version of what those boundaries would be. And just quickly, in terms of what makes it so special, I would say that I boil it down to the fact that it literally was a village that existed before the city of New York reached it, and it's always had this distinct identity that it's worked very hard to hold on to, even as the city has grown through it. So it's sort of never given up its original independent roots, even as it's become part of New York City, and that manifests itself in every way from the street grid to the mindset of the people who live here, the scale, the connection to history, and I think all of those other differences probably in some way intersect or emanate from that.
Well, being a West Villager, I'll weigh in with what I think of as the border between the Central Village and the West Village, although the New York Times doesn't always agree with me, but I put it at 7th Avenue. And yeah, the other boundaries, I'm just thinking about it. My parents both grew up on Staten Island, and my mother didn't know what the East Village was. To her, it was just the East Side, melding together the Lower East Side and the East Village. So that's what I have to say on the subject of boundaries. As for the character of the village, yes, obviously it's a village that predates the 1811 grid, which makes it quirky by definition, right? Because the layout is quirky, and refuses to conform with the rest of the city. I live on 12th Street, but 12th Street is, not where 12th Street is supposed to be when you go west, which is kind of nice. I think another piece of what makes the village is the fact that it fell into a slum for much of the early 20th century, and it was cheap. So that's where all the artists and musicians came along. And we still see the remnants of that culture. I hate the fact that it's just remnants. I don't know if people have other thoughts about this, but depressed real estate values, can work wonders in terms of culture, right? And okay, I'll see what John has to say.
I think it's simpler than that. The Greenwich Village, what is Greenwich Village, is haunted. And one of the things I find in this ghostly scenario is that because of the book I've been working on and all the people I've interviewed, when I walk down the street I can go, oh, that's where Edgar Allan Poe lives. Oh, that's where Joseph Cotton and Orson Welles were working on the script for Citizen Kane, blah, blah, blah. For sure, when you know where, it's one reason to read the books and to dig into it, because when you know where the ghosts live, you see them, you feel them for sure. I feel the companionship in all of that. There's also, I'll probably garble it, but there's a famous story of Hippolyte Havel, the revolutionary in the West Village, or in the village in those days, that he was serving a table, and the client said, or the customer said, can you tell me what are the boundaries of Greenwich Village? And he responded, saying, "There are no boundaries to Greenwich Village, it's a state of mind."
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that idea of Greenwich Village being haunted, because I feel as if especially in Greenwich Village, there's this sort of conflict between the past and the present, you know, what Greenwich Village was versus what it is today. And so, how much do you think that kind of conflict happens? Like, how do you see that conflict revealing itself now? Like, you know, Greenwich Village 40 years ago versus Greenwich Village, you know, when we kind of started to really perceive it collectively. Like, how are these differences, you know, how do you notice these differences over the years? What are some of the kind of struggles that you think the village encounters now in that sense?
It's a great question. You know, I would not phrase it as a conflict between the past and present, although I certainly think one could make that argument. I do think there's a tension, certainly between the two. And you know, one thing that I think is always interesting and worth keeping in mind is, you know, looking back on the sort of writings and the literature that came out of the neighborhood, there is not a period in the neighborhood's history when people didn't say, "Oh, you know what? It's over." It was 30 years ago. It was 50 years ago. They were saying that in the 1910s, you know, which is now looked at as sort of the Greenwich Village Renaissance. And look, I'm not burying my head in the sand. There's no denying that this is a very different neighborhood than it was a few decades ago, and its relationship to the city and you know, a lot of other things has changed significantly. It's a very, very wealthy place. It is not a place where, you know, young, broke artists come to start in terms of living, although it is still a place where people like that come to create and to be connected to other people who also want to create and be engaged in a creative community. And you know, it's not the place where the starving artists live so much anymore. It is a place where a lot of incredibly successful artists live, however. So there's definitely through currents that continue, although it clearly changes. And you know, as Michelle mentioned, you know, we tend to think of whatever trajectory we're on in the present as being eternal, and that's almost never true. I have no doubt that at some point, somewhere down the road, the village is not going to be as incredibly fashionable and desirable as it is now, and the cycling will continue.
Yeah, in terms of it being fashionable and desirable, I think about my grown kids who are 29 and 32 who can't afford to move here, but also they're very happy in Bed-Stuy where they're both living. I'm not sure they want to live here just because it's fashionable in a certain kind of way that is not appealing to them. I wonder if I'll be around for the day when it comes back around again as a more affordable alternative to other neighborhoods, because that's the way the city does go. And you make such a good point about, yes, the village being past its prime. I think there's a quotation from Lionel Trilling in here, who's claimed in, I think it was in the 1929 or 39, I can't remember what year, it said, you know, it was over. I wanted to read you just the dedication for my novel, because just thinking about ghosts in the village. So I dedicated it to villagers everywhere, the honorary, the adopted, and the natives, and then especially I named my two kids. But so the village being a state of mind, I thought, yes, that is true, right? You don't have to live in the village to feel like you're a villager, and to have that kind of bohemian focus and energy and passion.
So I was reading recently a book called Improper Bohemians. It's kind of a crazy book, but it's got some very interesting things in it. And on this subject, the author was reporting, and he said there was a period in the 1920s where the Max Easton and the John Reed group and generation was gone or had moved on, but the younger people were coming in, and it was in transit. And he said in that period, the ones that go back to the teens used to call the new kids the half villagers, and they in return called the old ones the former people.
That's great.
And also, I feel like Greenwich Village particularly has developed this long-standing reputation of eccentricity. You know, a place where one can be eccentric, where they can be a bit of an outlier, a bit of a, maybe like an exile of society, and that is welcomed and accepted. And it's almost become like the myth of Greenwich Village in some way. You know, this is where you can come and be accepted, or that was the case. You know, is that still the case now? And especially thinking, you know, Michelle, your book is titled Save the Village, and there's this kind of long-standing idea of, you know, how do we save the village? Like, what does it mean to save the village? Is that, how do we kind of perceive the future of Greenwich Village today based on like what you see now, you know, as this long-standing experience within the neighborhood?
Well, I will say one thing in terms of whether there's still something special about being villagers and feeling as if this is a more welcoming culture than many other cultures in this country. Just in recent conversations I've had, both with my sister who lives in Fresno and with various friends and students who live in different places around the country, even one student who lives right downtown San Francisco, with all that's going on in Israel and Gaza, I'm hearing from my relatives and friends and students comments like people being a little nervous about letting others know that they're Jewish, not knowing how they might be received. And I feel as if here in the village, you know, it's the minority that I belong to being a Jew, but I don't think twice about, you know, being openly Jewish in the neighborhood, in the city in general, for that matter. But I've realized that that's a kind of a richness that I take for granted that others elsewhere in the country right now are not feeling. So I do feel as if it's a welcoming, open culture, completely accepting of various different minorities. So that still, I feel, holds true.
Just to add to that, you know, I would say that I think that the village continues to be a place that's incredibly open and accepting in a variety of different ways. I don't think it's ever been perfect in that regard. You know, and it's interesting if you sort of look back, you know, one of the things that I think made the village was it had sort of become a slum, but even in its worst of times economically, there were still some well-to-do people, and it was always this sort of interesting mixture of the two, and it was never entirely bohemian, even at its most bohemian time. There was a very large Italian immigrant community, which there was certainly overlap and cross-pollination between the two, but that was a sort of different, distinct identity. So, you know, this was always a place where there was a lot of different kinds of mindsets, which I think allowed for a lot of different kinds of expression, and certainly historically was a place where barriers around race and gender and sexuality that were much more rigid in other places were much looser here. And I think that in a lot of ways that continues to be the case, but it's not by any means perfect now, and it wasn't in the past either. And in terms of how to, you know, kind of keep the village, I do think that there's no easy answer to that question, although it's a question that I think probably so many people in this room ponder all the time. I do think that the arts are a huge part of it, and that continues to be a big part of this neighborhood and where we are right now. And I also think that it being a place that continues to draw outsiders, A little bit less so in terms of, well, I mean, even the wealthy people who now are the people who move here come from all over the place. And the people who come here just to sort of visit and partake in the culture, the activity, etc., also come from all over the city, the metropolitan area, and the world. And I think that's a strength of the neighborhood. And those aspects will continue to make the village the village.
I think another aspect of that question can be also, what does the village want? Nobody's asking them. But I think that it's the same thing in working on a play or composing music. You're thinking, what does the song want to be? And since we've agreed that there are ghosts here, I think it's perfectly reasonable to invite them to the table.
Ouija board.
Yes.
So one of my favorite Calvin Trillin lines, I don't remember when or where I heard him say this, but he was asked when he was going to leave the village, and he said, "I'll leave when the Italians leave." And periodically my husband and I look at each other and we say, "Are the Italians still here? Please tell me there's still some Italians here."
I mean, there must still be Italians here, right? Okay, we have a little bit of time now for questions from the audience. So anybody? Yes?
I have two quick questions for Andrew. What's the name of the link on your website that brings you the photo collections?
If you just go to villagepreservation.org, in the main drop-down menu, you'll see it says images. So it's very easy to get to.
Okay. The other question is, are they in one with a church? What does it, this is a complicated question, but what does it take to save a place like that doesn't have very much money or power? Does it take someone with money to adopt a place like that to help it?
Let's have a follow-up conversation to really do that justice, but I will say, at least at the moment, we are trying to get the building landmarked, because if it's not, I fear it's going to be sold for development, and the building itself will simply cease to exist. In terms of all the other intersecting things, that's a much more complicated conversation, but let's follow up with each other and try to do that.
Other questions? Yes.
Okay, I have two questions about the Earl. One, it was my understanding, and obviously you're the expert, but the California Dreaming,
Yeah.
wasn't that the Albert Hotel?
Well, no, Michelle says it was, and John says that it was the Earl. And since I'm writing about the Earl, I agree with you. Yeah.
Okay, and
For what it's worth, I've heard the Albert too, but clearly he's done some investigating.
okay, yeah, that's what I'm saying. I'm not the expert. It's just rumor with me. There's a place called the Wakely Gallery.
Sure.
You know that?
Sure,
Is that
sure.
a real place?
Yes, it's still there. It's part of North Square, the restaurant that's connected with the hotel.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, and it's a true story. I mean, it was the director's granny,
Yes.
that Elaine May won the Tony Award for. Yeah. But it was a gallery. Milton Avery, for instance, was one of the people who exhibited there. A lot of other interesting people from that era, and Avery's wife, who was a respected painter as well in that period. So, yeah, a lot of things were in that. There's a section of the book called The Annexes, because there were these little things that used to be separate from the hotel, which step by step they kind of took a hold of and kept alive.
Okay. So it's a restaurant. It's not a restaurant.
It's a restaurant.
It's in the
Oh, yes, restaurant.
No,
Yeah.
that's where it is.
Yeah.
Other questions? Or comments?
Yes. I'd like to comment on how the village has changed or hasn't changed, or what it was like. Because I've lived in the West Village, I guess, since 1976, and I constantly walk around. And, you know, I was attracted to the village because of the low rise and also the bohemian nature and the arts. All the arts, the artists, the writers, the poets, the musicians, the whole thing, you know, was pervasive. And over the years, and also each part of the village had an identity. And it was a community Village, for example, would be very punk. He's more punk. More drugs in the East Village, and the West Village was more, the writers, the St. Vincent Millay group, and the artists, and then maybe a little more wealthy. And the South Village was more Italian, and you had your mom and pop shops all over. So Bleecker Street, between 6th and 7th Avenue, they were shops that you needed to live. The corner shop was the Portuguese fruit store, and then there was Cito's Bakery, and Anna Manelli's was the meat store, and Murray's Cheese was still there. But you didn't have these kind of useless, stores, that really. So it was part of the fabric of the community, and you had certain cafes and bars, that you felt part of a community. And I think over the years, with the real estate prices increasing, and I was in real estate, and I think it's the real estate's fault, the industry fault, because prices have dictated, who's moving there and destroying the contents of the interiors of beautiful brownstones and putting 3 of them together, and so on and so forth. So, and also I think it's becoming, as I told you, Andrew, more vanilla, a little more vanilla. It's not, you don't see, this same kind of folk. Maybe now that I was living there when I was young, in my 20s, now I'm old, So maybe that's just a factor of being older, but it's a whole new generation. I think it's real estate driven. They're not there because of, a lot of them, not all, are there not for the arts, it's for the real estate, and they can afford it. And so, thank God we have the bricks and mortar so you can feel a sense of history when you walk around. And there was the plaque, there was at St. Vincent Millay's house, and there was James Baldwin's house. I mean, that's so important, so thank you. And I just wanted to put my 2 cents in.
Do any of you want to comment on that?
I think there's a lot of truth in all of that. My own personal memories of the village go back to the early 1980s. I grew up in New York City in the Bronx, and I started coming here as a teenager, and it was an exciting and incredibly different place from the much less diverse, much more sort of regimented, much more kind of narrow community that I came out of. Both physically, I grew up in a place called Co-op City, which I don't know if you know, in the sort of Northeast Bronx. We were the first family to live in our apartment, and basically the entire place that we lived in was all built at once. And to be in a neighborhood that had all of these different layers was just amazing, and very different kinds of people. And yeah, we have to grapple with the reality that the village has changed in a lot of ways and is much less diverse in terms of who can choose to live here. But it's still unlike any place else in terms of what you can see and experience on a daily basis on these streets, and the architecture, which is just unlike anywhere else. So we're blessed with what we have, and we have to keep working to preserve it and to keep it, and to make it even better.
I'm just thinking about some aspects of the village that are fairly eternal. We have our 2 library branches. We're very unusual, right? We have our beautiful gardens, the Jefferson Market Garden, St. Luke's Garden, the churches that are still a going concern, most of them, the rivers on either side. I still find myself walking down Hudson Street almost every single day. I no longer have kids to take to school. I no longer have a dog to walk. But Hudson Street is largely still small businesses. We've got a Rite Aid. We've got ice cream chain, small local ice cream chain. But other than that, it's
much more populous, Hudson Street.
Oh, well, it's getting ridiculous in the evenings. Yeah, thank heaven I don't have to live above all those restaurants and bars. Wine bars are now a really big deal. Everybody's out.
The rent is so high.
Yeah. But Hudson Street is still a homey street, so that there's still a lot that is there, and you know, gazillion businesses that have survived. So you have to stop and love them and patronize them.
There's still a sidewalk ballet and the Eyes on the Street on Hudson Street.
Yes, the Jane Jacobs sidewalk ballet. Yes.
Street
Okay, well, any final closing comments from anyone before we conclude? Okay, so thank you to our 3 panelists for their wonderful presentation. And thank you all so much for coming. In the back, there is actually some of Michelle's books available if you'd like to check them out. And we have refreshments in the back as well, so please feel free to enjoy them. Thank you.
Thank you.